A loaf of bread hides more than a meal. It hides a message. Welcome to Eco Misteriosa. I am your host, Urvela. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in. I love reading your words. Now, the mystery begins. It was upon a raw and rain-lashed November morning that I found myself once more seated across from my friend, Sherlock Holmes, in our Baker Street sitting room. The fire crackled with a quiet defiance against the dreary drizzle that trickled down the windows like slow tears. Holmes, sprawled as ever in his dressing gown, was deep in contemplation over a monograph on the flammability of various pipe tobaccos, a subject I privately considered rather more combustible than the material itself. Our breakfast had been modest. Holmes scarcely touched his, and the silence between us was broken only by the occasional hiss of the gas lamps or the faint rustle of newspaper pages. It was then, precisely at 9:10 that the doorbell rang with a sense of urgency rarely heard outside of fire brigades and fatal telegrams. Mrs. Hudson, flustered and pink-cheeked, appeared a moment later with a peculiar announcement. "Mr. Albert Greaves, sir, a baker from Whitechapel, says it's a matter of life and death." Holmes's eyes lit with sudden animation. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson. A man whose profession revolves around daily proofs and exact measures is unlikely to waste time with trivialities." Moments later, a soaked and trembling man of perhaps 50 entered. His hands, red and cracked from years of kneading dough, twisted his sodden cap with nervous energy. His white apron bore smudges of flour and, more curiously, a faint, rust-colored blotch near the hem, "Mr. Holmes," he stammered, his voice a rasp of worry. "They say you can see things no other man can. I don't know what to make of it, sir. It's me, Bread." Holmes's brows arched. "You're Bread, Mr. Greaves?" "Yes. Sir, I run Greaves & Sons on Tewkesbury Lane. Been baking near on 30 years, I have. But yesterday morning, one of our loaves, just an ordinary rye boule, had something inside it." He reached into his coat and drew out a crumpled brown paper parcel, hastily tied with twine. With an apologetic glance, he opened it on Holmes's desk. Inside lay a half-loaf of dense brown bread. Holmes examined it with surgical care. "There, sir," Greaves said, pointing to a ragged tear along the crust. "That's where my lad Charlie found it. Said it was too heavy for a loaf, so he sliced it, and there, right inside the dough, was this." Holmes extracted a small, crumpled square of parchment. It had clearly endured both heat and compression, its edges browned and cracked. On it, in spidery ink that had bled with moisture and age, were the words, "He who knows the kneading knows the killing. Find the blue ledger, or the ovens will burn again." Watson, who had risen to peer over, Holmes's shoulder uttered a low whistle. "Good Lord, is it some form of threat?" "I dare say it is," Holmes murmured, his eyes alight, "though what intrigues me is not the message's menace, but its method of conveyance. Hidden in a loaf of bread. Extraordinary." Greaves wrung his cap with fresh vigor. "Sir, I didn't put it there. No one in my shop did. I'd stake my name on it. And last night, well, something else happened." He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Someone broke into the shop, nothing taken. But the ovens, they'd been turned on, all three, red hot, in the middle of the night. Could have burned the whole place down." Holmes's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to still. He rose from his chair with a fluid grace and turned to Watson. "Pack your coat, Watson. It appears we are summoned not to a crime already committed, but to one yet waiting to occur. A cryptic threat, an intrusion without theft, and a message baked into bread. Yes, the game, I believe, is already afoot." Holmes and I arrived at Tewkesbury Lane under a bleak sky, still heavy with drizzle, the gas lamps hissing faintly in the gloom of mid-morning. The neighborhood bore all the trappings of the working-class quarter it was, a cramped web of narrow streets lined with drab, soot-streaked buildings. The sweet, comforting scent of yeast and scorched flour drifted faintly in the air, almost disguising the stench of wet cobbles and horses. Greaves' Bakery was a modest two-story affair, wedged between a tobacconist's and a greengrocer. A painted sign Greaves & Sons, Estridors 1871, swung from a wrought-iron bracket above the door, creaking slightly in the wind. As we stepped inside, the warmth of the ovens wrapped around us like a thick shawl, and for a moment I forgot entirely that we were there in response to something so peculiar and sinister. The interior was simple. Counters dusted with flour, shelves stacked with loaves of rye sourdough and crusty white batons. A young boy of perhaps 12 was behind the counter, busy weighing dough on a rusted scale. "My son Charlie," said Greaves. "He's the one who found the message." The boy looked up with large, pale eyes, a smudge of flour across his brow like a soldier's war paint. "Go on, Charlie," Greaves said gently. "Tell Mr. Holmes what you told me." Charlie licked his lips nervously. "Well, sir, I was slicing the rye loaves like I always do. This one was heavier than the others. Thought it was just overproofed or maybe the scales were off, but when I cut into it, the knife hit something hard. That's when I found the paper, all rolled up in the middle like someone had folded it tight and baked it right in." Holmes took a slow turn around the shop, his gaze moving not just over the shelves and counters, but also the floor, the ceiling, the faint soot marks near the ovens. He was silent for a long moment, then approached the proving station. "You bake everything here, I take it?" "Yes," said Greaves. "All dough is mixed and shaped downstairs in the prep room. We proof it overnight and bake here upstairs." "In the morning?" Holmes's gaze narrowed. "And the rye boules?" "Batch mixed every evening. Charlie and I shape them, place them on wooden trays, and let them rise overnight. First thing next morning we bake them. No strangers in the shop during that process?" Greaves shook his head. "Impossible. Once we lock up, it's just me and Charlie, and we live upstairs. I keep the keys." Holmes turned to the staircase at the back of the shop. "Might we see the prep room?" Greaves led us down a steep, narrow stair into a cellar where the smell of yeast and damp mingled oppressively. Stone walls gleamed with condensation and iron racks lined one side of the room, each cradling trays dusted with flour. A long wooden table stood in the center, and in one corner, an ancient dough mixer stood like a mechanical beast frozen mid-growl. Holmes examined everything with exaggerated care. He touched the trays, sniffed the flours, lifted a lid from a rising tub of fermenting starter. His hand hovered over the kneading station. "Do you use any mechanical aids when shaping the dough?" "Only the old kneader," said Greaves, motioning to the rusted contraption. "But not for the boules. Those are shaped by hand." Holmes nodded, tapping a finger to his lips in thought. It would be difficult indeed for someone to slip a message into a boule after it has begun proofing. The crust would show signs of tampering, and you noticed none? "Not a mark," Greaves replied. "And yet someone managed to insert a parchment into a fully baked loaf without your knowledge, and using your equipment. Curious indeed." Watson, feeling the tension rise in the cellar, interjected, "And what of the intruder last night? You said the ovens were found burning." Greaves nodded grimly. "Yes, I was woken around 3 by the smell of smoke. Came down and found the ovens roaring, 3 of them red hot. But nothing had been put inside, not a crumb. The door was locked from the inside, and the keys were where I left them. No sign of a break-in." Holmes knelt beside the oven, examining the stone beneath the iron hinges. He traced a finger along the blackened edge and lifted something from a crevice. A small flake of wax. He held it aloft with a gleam in his eye. "Interesting." Watson leaned closer. "Wax?" "Sealing wax. Possibly used to affix the message inside the bread, though how it withstood the heat of the oven is another question. But more importantly, it's out of place. There's no reason sealing wax should be near the ovens, unless someone brought it here for a purpose. He stood and dusted his hands. "Mr. Greaves," Holmes said, "do you keep a ledger? Something to track your deliveries, suppliers, staff wages, anything of that sort?" Greaves blinked. "Aye, of course, in my desk upstairs. Why?" "Because the note mentioned a blue ledger, and such specificity is never casual." Upstairs in the modest office adjacent to the family kitchen, Greaves produced a heavy, cloth-bound book from a drawer. It was indeed blue. Holmes flipped through its brittle pages with great care. Each entry was neatly recorded in ink, detailing expenses, flour deliveries, accounts settled and owed. He turned 2 pages, then stopped. His finger tapped the margin. "There's an entry missing," Watson leaned in. "How can you tell?" "The sequence of numbers. Here, entry 1682 is followed by 1684. Moreover, the ink bleeds are different. This page has been tampered with. Someone tore a sheet clean out." Greaves looked horrified. "That ledger doesn't leave this room." Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, You mentioned you live upstairs, but has anyone stayed recently? Any relatives, employees with access beyond the shop floor? Greaves hesitated. Well, my brother-in-law, Fergus, my wife's brother. He stayed for 2 nights last week, lost his lodgings and needed a place to rest. Holmes's voice became taut. And where is Mr. Fergus now? Gone, said he. Had work in Liverpool and left Sunday morning. Would you object, Holmes asked, if we had a look at the guest room he used? Greaves led us to a small chamber just off the landing. A narrow bed, half made, stood beneath a foggy window. The floorboards creaked beneath our steps. Holmes moved quickly, scanning the shelves, the rug, and then crouching by the bed. With a deft hand, he reached beneath the frame and withdrew a small canvas pouch. He unfastened it carefully. Inside were 3 items: a burned match, a length of baker's twine, and a crumpled scrap of dark blue paper, the exact shade of the ledger cover. Holmes unfolded it. Scrawled in hasty pencil were 2 names: J. Elridge, 18 Octef, Underwood, 3. Nov Holmes handed it to me silently. Who are these men? I asked. Greaves paled. Both are former delivery boys. Elridge left a month ago. Underwood, he was due to start just yesterday. Holmes's face darkened. And did he? No, sent word that he changed his mind. Holmes looked out the window. The street beyond was grey and lifeless. There's something brewing here, he said softly. Her message planted with intent. A name missing from the ledger. An intruder who turns on ovens but steals nothing. And now, 2 former employees, one with a connection to your brother-in-law. He turned to me with a glint in his eye. Watson, we must pay a visit to J. Elridge. There is more to this bread than yeast and flour. We left the bakery without delay, the tension in the Greaves household weighing heavily behind us. Holmes was unusually quiet as we walked, hands clasped behind his back, eyes downcast beneath the brim of his hat. He moved not with indecision, but with concentrated calculation, as though the fog-draped streets of Whitechapel were less a passageway than a chessboard, upon which some unseen opponent had made a daring move. Do we know where this Elridge fellow lives? I asked as we turned onto Commercial Street. We do, Holmes replied. I had Greaves write the addresses of both men while you were examining the guest room. Elridge resides in a boarding house on Pelham Street. If he's still there, we'll find him. If not, he paused. We may be looking for more than just a delivery boy. The lodging house proved to be a peeling brick affair with curtains that drooped like tired eyelids. A landlady of impressive girth and impatience met us at the door, suspicious. Until Holmes produced both charm and a sovereign. Elridge? She sniffed. Hadn't seen him in a week. Paid through the month, though. Strange one, kept to himself, worked odd hours, used to get up at dawn, then not show his face till supper. Took most of his meals out. Came back late 2 nights ago, quiet as a church mouse, then vanished again. Did he leave anything behind? Holmes asked. Room's locked, she said. Didn't clean it yet. Still airing out. Holmes was already reaching into his coat. Would you permit us to examine it? I assure you it may prevent greater trouble. She narrowed her eyes, hesitated, then fetched the key. The room was sparse. A narrow cot, a trunk and a battered writing desk beneath a cracked mirror. A single oil lamp stood on the sill, casting its faint scent of burnt wick. Holmes stepped, in lightly as if afraid to disturb the dust. He went straight to the desk, opening drawers with the ease of a man who had opened thousands. Receipts, pencil stubs, old newsprint clippings. He paused at a folded sheaf of papers, cuttings from the Times and the Evening Standard, all circled or annotated in pencil. Every article concerned either fires in industrial buildings or the investigation of bakery thefts across East London. One headline read, Mysterious fire destroys mill in Shoreditch, cause unknown. Watson, Holmes murmured. Our boy is either hunting arsonists or planning his own performance. At the foot of the bed, Holmes pried open the trunk. Inside were only 2 items, a threadbare coat and lying beneath it, a slim notebook bound in stained leather. He opened it carefully. The first few pages were lists, names, times, and what appeared to be notes on various bakeries, including Greaves & Sons. But what caught Holmes' attention was the final entry. He tore it free and held it up to the light. Fergus asked for the formula again. Said it was the last time. Don't trust him. He keeps talking about the ovens. If this goes badly, I'll take it to Underwood instead. He's got sense. Either way, it ends this week. No more fire. Holmes tapped the word formula with his finger. It's beginning to take shape, Watson. I suspect we are not looking at a simple threat. There is something of value, intellectual. Property, perhaps, being passed in secret and hidden through unconventional means. You mean seen bread? Precisely. Ingenious, really. What better way to communicate under the noses of prying eyes than to embed messages in something? Consumed daily? Temporary, disposable, and difficult to intercept unless you know where to look. But then, what is this formula? A recipe? Holmes gave a half smile. Possibly. Or a chemical compound? A baking agent? Something far more dangerous? Before I could respond, there came a knock, sharp, hesitant. The landlady poked her head around the door. Sorry to intrude, but there's a young man downstairs. Says his name's Underwood. Looking for Mr. Elridge. Holmes and I exchanged glances. Send him up at once. Underwood entered nervously, barely more than 17. He had a mop of dark hair and wore the shabby blue uniform of a delivery boy, his cap twisted in his hands, and his gaze darted from me to Holmes like a hunted animal. "Mr. Holmes," he said softly, "you're looking for Joe Elridge." "We are," Holmes replied, his tone calm and non-threatening. "Do you know where he is?" "No, sir. That's why I came. He sent me this." Underwood reached into his coat and handed Holmes a folded piece of waxy parchment. "Came through my letterbox yesterday morning." Holmes unfolded the sheet, which bore a familiar spidery handwriting. F. If anything happens to me, go to the tunnels beneath the old Branning mill. The formula's there. Watch Fergus. Trust no one. Burn this. Holmes's brow furrowed. "Did you tell anyone about this note?" Underwood shook his head. "No, sir. I was afraid. Joe and we used to deliver together. He told me last month that something was going on at the Greaves shop. Said someone was using the bread orders for messages. That's when Fergus started showing up. Why didn't you take the job?" I asked. He looked shamefaced. "Because the last time I saw Joe, he said he thought he was being followed. And then Fergus offered to train me personally. Something didn't feel right." Holmes handed the note to me and turned back to Underwood. "Did Elridge ever tell you what this formula was?" "No. Just that someone was desperate to get it and willing to burn shops to do it." Holmes's voice sharpened. "Has Fergus ever worked with chemicals? In a mill, perhaps?" Underwood blinked. "He used to. Said he worked at Branning Mill before it burned down last year." Holmes straightened. "Then that is our next destination." We dismissed Underwood with instructions to keep silent. Holmes hailed a cab, and we rode swiftly through the muddy streets toward the ruins of Branning Mill, a husk of stone and iron left skeletal after a blaze many months before. The structure loomed against the grey sky like a gutted cathedral. We arrived near dusk and the light had begun to wane. The entrance was boarded up, but Holmes found a loose panel near the east wall and slipped inside. The air within was sour, with soot and mildew. The ground floor was charred and hollow, but the stone stairwell, somehow spared, led down to what had once been storage tunnels. We lit a lamp and descended in silence. The tunnels were low and damp, thick with silence, broken only by the scuttling of unseen rats. Holmes moved carefully, trailing his fingers along the walls. Then he stopped. There, etched into the soot-streaked stone, was a faint mark, the symbol of a wheat sheaf, carved with precision. Below it, in the dirt, a section of floor appeared, disturbed. Holmes knelt and began clearing it away. Within moments he uncovered a small iron box, locked. He pulled a slim tool from his coat, and with a few deft movements, it clicked open. Inside lay 3 sheets of thick paper, folded and pressed, flat. On them, written in clean chemist's script, were complex formulae, columns of numbers, measurements, and abbreviations I did not recognize. Alongside them sat a glass vial, sealed tight with wax. Holmes examined the sheets, then the vial, with grave interest. "This," he said quietly, "is no baking recipe." "What is it then?" "I can't say yet. But whatever it is, it's valuable enough to kill for. And somewhere above us, in the shadows of the abandoned mill, I fancied I heard the faint creak of a footstep. Holmes's hand shot to my arm. "Quiet, Watson," he whispered. "We are not alone." Holmes extinguished the lantern with a swift twist, plunging us into the thick, velvet dark of the tunnel. I strained my ears, the blood in them pounding. Like drums. Somewhere above, the sound came again, a faint scrape against stone, deliberate and cautious. Holmes crouched low beside the iron box, one hand closing gently around the vial within, the other signaling for silence. We waited. The sound grew nearer, a soft, uneven tread, as though someone were attempting stealth but favored one foot. Then, abruptly, it stopped. Holmes leaned toward me and whispered, barely audible, "Stay here, guard the papers. If I'm not back in 5 minutes, follow the path out and return to Baker Street. Do not engage." But Holmes, he was already moving, silent as breath, receding into the darkness with that singular fluidity of motion I had seen only in panthers and the most adept burglars. I clutched the box against my chest and held my revolver close, each second stretching into a rope of suspense drawn too tight. 5 minutes passed, then 6. A sound behind me, no, above, made me turn, heart hammering. I raised the pistol. A whisper, "Watson." Holmes emerged from the gloom, a slight sheen of sweat on his brow and something unreadable in his expression. "Gone," he said. He heard us. I found his boot print in the ash by the northeast stairwell. Clever to approach above us, cleverer still to retreat before confirming what we found. Did you see who it was? No, but I suspect it was Fergus, or someone, in his employ. He knows we're onto something, and he's watching this place. We wrapped the papers tightly in oilcloth, concealed the vial in Holmes's coat, and retraced our steps into the open air, where the London mist now coiled low, to the ground like a living thing. The cab we had hired still waited, the driver hunched and miserable beneath his hat. Holmes gave him an address not of Baker Street, but of Scotland Yard. "The nature of this discovery is no longer a matter of local intrigue," he said grimly. "That formula is a chemical compound of alarming complexity. I believe it may be a form of incendiary accelerant, possibly for use in industrial sabotage or even warfare." I looked at him, startled. "Then the fires, Shoreditch, the ovens at Greaves." "Tests," Holmes confirmed. "Controlled environments, each growing more daring. The mill fire was no accident, Watson. Elridge may have once worked there, and realized the truth. That would explain his fear. It may also be why he disappeared." At the yard, Holmes delivered the materials personally to Inspector Gregson, who promised the forensic division would examine the formula. Holmes remained vague in his explanation, only hinting that it pertained to a potential act of coordinated arson. Gregson, to his credit, asked few questions, but promised immediate discretion. From there we returned home. It was well past midnight by the time Holmes removed his coat, but his manner showed no signs of fatigue. I poured him a cup of coffee, while he stood by the window staring into the wet, glistening night. "Something still doesn't fit," he said at last. "You mean Fergus?" "Partly. He is no simple opportunist. There is a pattern here, Watson, larger than a stolen formula or a jealous brother-in-law. These messages hidden in bread. Ingenious, yes. But why persist with that method even after Elridge became aware of it?" He paced slowly, lips pursed. Someone was using Greaves's bakery as a courier service, but who was the message meant for? The note mentioned a blue ledger, I offered, and the missing page. Perhaps an accomplice inside the business. Or a recipient, Holmes murmured. The page may have contained delivery details, names, addresses, coordinated drop-offs disguised as orders. He paused, brow furrowing. "Tell me, Watson, did you notice anything odd about the bakery's client list?" "I didn't examine it." "I did, briefly. Most customers were from the immediate area. Shops, families, a few tea houses. But one stood out. A repeat delivery to a Mr. A. Palmer, received every Tuesday and Friday for the last 4 months. And yet, according to Greaves, he's never met Palmer in person. The payments came in coin, left in an envelope beneath the mat. You think Palmer is our link?" "I think," Holmes said, striding to the mantel and pulling the ledger from his coat, "that we pay Mr. Palmer a surprise visit, if he exists." The next morning, under pale grey light, we followed the address from the ledger. No. 42 Hartnell Street, a squat terrace row lined with shuttered windows and soot-stained bricks. No. 42 had no sign on the door, and its curtains were drawn, though the letterbox flapped slightly in the wind. Holmes stepped forward, knelt, and examined the hinge of the box. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small tin of fine ash, which he blew lightly over the handle. "Observe," he said. "2 fresh prints, the right thumb and forefinger. Someone retrieved something this morning." He tried the door. Locked. Without waiting for an invitation, Holmes retrieved a small pick from his coat. In less than a minute, the lock clicked and we slipped inside. The flat was empty, but not abandoned. The sitting room was clean and Spartan, with a single desk, a bookshelf lined with ledgers, and a cot in the corner. Holmes opened the desk drawer and withdrew a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. He unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay a loaf of rye bread, sliced cleanly down the center, and embedded within a folded paper stained with flour and heat. "Another message," Holmes breathed. He opened it. The words were in the same hand as, "Before Palmer, Friday's drop is the last, they suspect. Use code 7 for the Alexandria route. Burn this." He handed it to me, then stepped to the bookshelf, pulling out ledgers at random. "All blank," he muttered. "Just props." The sound of a floorboard creaking upstairs made us both freeze. Holmes gestured for silence. We crept up the narrow staircase, revolvers drawn. At the top landing, a door stood ajar. Holmes pushed it open with one finger. The man inside, tall, lean, with a hawk-like nose, was in the process of burning papers in a tin waste bin. He whirled as we entered, eyes wild, and made for the window. Holmes leapt forward, catching the man by the collar and throwing him bodily to the floor. I pinned his legs as Holmes pressed his arm against the man's throat. "You are not Mr. Palmer," Holmes growled. The man coughed. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Save your breath. The ink on your fingers, the residue of flour on your boots, the vial stain on your cuff. You've handled every part of this operation." The man went still. Holmes released him. "I suggest you speak, and swiftly. Scotland Yard will be here within the hour. But I have questions you may wish to answer before then, such as the identity of the final recipient and the true meaning of Alexandria route." The man stared up at Holmes with a mix of fury and resignation. "You're too late," he hissed. "You've only uncovered the tail, the head's already moving." Holmes sat back on his heels, and for the first time in the case I saw genuine unease flicker across his face. "We've stumbled not into a plot," he murmured, "but into a network." The man Holmes had pinned to the floor gave his name after some coaxing as Roland Vetch, a name which meant nothing to me, but caused Holmes's eyes to narrow slightly, as if a forgotten thread had just resurfaced in his mind. We secured him in the upstairs chair, wrists bound with a length of lamp cord I found behind the bureau. Holmes paced before him, calm but relentless, while I examined the documents Vetch had not managed to consign to flame. Most were cryptic, columns of numbers, some bearing foreign place names, others reduced to what looked like shipping codes. A recurring emblem, a sheaf of wheat stamped in red wax, appeared on several sheets. Holmes tapped one such mark. "Tell me, Mr. Vetch, what does this symbol denote?" "Your secret society of bakers." Vetch glared. "You'll never understand what you've stumbled into." Holmes cocked an eyebrow. "On the contrary, I understand precisely what you want me to think. This is not about the bread. It is about the communication through it. The formula, the messages, the deliveries. Someone has been using commercial bakeries as an underground post. Efficient, untraceable, and dismissed by even the sharpest constables as mere commerce." He turned to me. "Watson, do you recall the message hidden in the loaf from Greaves's shop? It mentioned the Alexandria route. Now consider this. Alexandria is a known point of contact for Mediterranean shipping. There is a merchant corridor between London's Docklands and the Levant, one riddled with gaps in oversight." I nodded, beginning to follow. "I believe we are dealing with a smuggling ring," Holmes continued, "but one of a far more cunning kind than the usual contraband. These are not simple criminals running opium or silk. They are transporting intelligence, recipes for chemicals, possibly even weapons research, disguised and passed along in loaves, ledgers, and ledger codes." Vetch laughed mirthlessly. "You think I know everything? I'm only a link in the chain." "Indeed," Holmes said, stepping closer. but I suspect you know where the next link leads. You see, Mr. Vetch, we've already turned the materials over to Scotland Yard. The formula is being studied by experts as we speak. If you do not wish to be named as the architect of what may be classified as an incendiary weapon, Vetch paled slightly. Then I suggest you speak plainly. Who is Palmer? Where is Fergus? And where, precisely, does this chain lead? Vetch hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, Palmer's not a man, it's a signal word. Anyone receiving a parcel marked for Palmer knows they're part of the transmission line. Fergus was a courier, same as me. We were assigned to different nodes. And the Alexandria route. It's a schedule. Certain messages go east, others west. Alexandria was eastbound, destined for a contact in Constantinople. Fergus handled all physical drops through bakeries. He was perfect for it. No one suspects a baker. And where is Fergus now? Vetch swallowed. There's a safe house near Limehouse Basin. Disused boarding house, grey shutters. They rotate through there every few days. If he's not there now, someone else will. Holmes straightened. Then we must act before word of this arrest spreads through your little fraternity. We bound Vetch more securely and left him for the yard to collect, with a hastily scrawled note from Holmes outlining the nature of the situation and the urgency of a quiet response. We took a cab east, the city growing rougher as we approached the docks. Holmes said little, but his posture was taut as a drawn wire, his mind clearly grinding through a dozen connections. The boarding house on Limehouse Basin was exactly as Vetch had described, set back from the quay, its grey shutters shut tight, despite the early hour, with only a faint light visible through a crack in the frame. Holmes signalled for silence as we dismounted from the cab and approached on foot. We crept around to the alley, where a narrow side entrance sat partly ajar. Inside, the air was stale and tinged with oil and mildew. The ground floor was silent. Holmes motioned for me to wait, then disappeared down a hallway, returning moments later with a subtle shake of his head. He pointed upward. We climbed the stairs with caution, revolvers drawn, from behind the second. A door, we heard voices, one deep and unmistakably angry, the other higher, strained and pleading. Fergus, Holmes mouthed. He reached for the handle, but just then, a loud crack echoed inside, like a slap or a boot against flesh. Holmes didn't. Wait! He kicked the door in with a force I did not know he possessed. The room was bare, but for two men, Fergus, unmistakable in his baker's apron and wild red beard, and a young man crumpled in the corner, face bruised, shirt torn. Fergus turned, startled, and went for his coat pocket. But Holmes was on him in an instant, flinging him against the wall with such violence the plaster cracked. I covered the second man, who raised his hands in surrender. Holmes stripped the pocket and drew out a folded sheet of paper, identical in form and substance to the others. He handed it to me and bent over the young man. Elridge, he said with relief. You're lucky we came when we did. Elridge groaned. He found out I'd passed the message to Underwood, said I'd ruined everything, was going to ship me in a flour barrel to France. Fergus spat a mouthful of blood. You fools have no idea what you've interrupted. Holmes towered over him. On the contrary, I now see the full picture. The network uses bread as a carrier, a disguise so brilliant in its mundanity that no one ever questioned the loaves. Fergus, you used your brother-in-law's bakery without his knowledge, tampered with his ledger, and turned an honest business into a front for espionage. Fergus grinned with unrepentant defiance. The world's changing, Holmes. Empires don't last on toast and marmalade. No, Holmes said, but they may fall through those very means if fools like you continue your games. We brought them both to the yard. Elridge was treated for his injuries and agreed to provide full testimony. The papers retrieved from the flat, when cross-referenced with the deciphered codes in the original ledger, mapped out a network of over a dozen bakery fronts across London, each tied to an international recipient. Gregson was astonished. So the whole thing, he said as Holmes finished briefing him that evening, all this time was a form of baked intelligence? Holmes nodded. A most literal kind of underground movement, hidden in plain sight, where no one would think to look. But as with all schemes, the more complex they become, the more fragile the structure. One burned loaf, one panicked courier, and it all comes crumbling down. Back in Baker Street, with the fire burning low and a silence settling over us like a dust, I poured us both a modest brandy. I must admit, I said, I've never regarded a bakery with suspicion before. Holmes allowed a small smile. Nor should you, Watson. But it does remind one of the danger in ignoring the commonplace. Crime, like yeast, thrives in warm, unnoticed places. And what will become of the formula? Destroyed if the yard has sense. Its purpose is too obscure, too open to misuse. He leaned back, eyes heavy, but mine no doubt still racing. I raised my glass. To the loaf that nearly ignited London. Holmes clinked his glass against mine. To bread and circuses, Watson, and to the messages they may yet conceal. The days that followed the arrests of Fergus and Vetch were marked by a strange stillness, as though the city itself held its breath. Holmes, however, did not rest. Though the formal structure of the smuggling ring had been dismantled, he sensed, with that peculiar instinct of his, that an essential piece remained obscured, an absent king on the chessboard. He spent much of the next morning hunched over our breakfast table, cross-referencing the coded messages recovered from the Palmer, flat with various shipping manifests, railway timetables and commercial orders. He had me take dictation as he sorted names, dates and figures, organizing the network's movements with almost obsessive precision. "There is always a hub, Watson," he muttered, eyes darting across the columns. These messages did not spring from Fergus's mind. He was merely a handler. Vetch, too. The breadth of this scheme suggests a singular origin, someone with access to logistics, to finance, and above all, to loyalty. "How you believe the mastermind remains at large?" "I believe we have only seen the bones of the beast. Its brain is still at liberty." He tapped one line in a manifest I had transcribed from a message dated 2 weeks prior. "Note this. A parcel delivered to Mr. Hargrave. No address, no collection." That, Watson, is a ghost identity, a placeholder used when a message is not meant to move forward. To whom, then, was it truly meant? Holmes stood abruptly and retrieved the original Greaves ledger. He thumbed to the earliest entries Fergus might have accessed and pointed to a single line near the bottom. "Here," he said. 4 months ago, a new customer appeared. Initials only. J.R. Special weekly crate. Paid in coin. That crate was never recorded in the outgoing balance. Why?" He snapped the book shut. "Because it was never meant for sale. That crate was Fergus's first courier drop, and whoever J.R. is, he initiated this entire network. Before Vetch, before Palmer, he may even be the source of the formula." A telegram arrived that afternoon from Inspector Gregson. The formula had indeed been analyzed by chemists at the yard. It was a compound derivative, volatile, quick to ignite when in powdered form, and uniquely resistant to early detection by scent or residue. It could be integrated into flour itself and transported harmlessly until activated with heat and pressure. Holmes read the report twice, lips tightening. "So that was the brilliance," he said. "They didn't just hide messages in the bread. They could hide the weapon itself. A loaf, harmless in appearance, might become the very device to destroy the oven that baked it." I was struck cold. "You mean the fires weren't just demonstrations, they were actual tests of the compound?" "Precisely. Controlled trials to refine the dosage, timing, and disguise." He rang for Mrs. Hudson and dictated a telegram to be sent immediately to the naval dockyards, warning them of potential threats hidden in supply shipments. Then he turned to me. "We must find J.R. "How?" "We start where it all began. Greaves's shop, the crate that bore no customer. We overlooked it before, focused as we were on the message, but something was delivered there that set this network in motion. That afternoon, we returned to Tewkesbury Lane. Greaves, though, weary and still shaken by the revelations, welcomed us with a sort of reverent anxiety. Holmes was direct. "Mr. Greaves, do you recall a client referred to only by the initials J.R.? They first appeared in your ledger 4 months ago, ordering a weekly crate." Greaves frowned. "J.R.? No one ever came in asking for that name. But now you say it. Yes, I remember the crate. Odd one. Came already sealed, like a hamper. Fergus insisted it was a new supplier arrangement." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Supplier, so he said. He handled the crate himself. Would take it downstairs, said he'd sort it. Did you ever see its contents? Greaves shook his head. No, sir. Holmes motioned for us to descend into the cellar once more. Down there he moved with purposeful intent, examining the racks and stone walls. Then he stopped beside the old flour sacks, stacked near the kneading table. He knelt and pulled one aside, revealing a dusty wooden panel in the wall, at first glance, merely part of the masonry. Holmes ran his hand along the edge and pried it. Loose with a thin blade, behind it was a narrow cavity, just wide enough to hold a crate, and inside, still wrapped in coarse burlap, sat a parcel. Holmes unwrapped it with great care. Within were 3 sealed jars of fine white powder, labelled in a slanted hand, flour substitute, high yield. Alongside it, in a wax-sealed envelope, was a single card. Holmes read it aloud. Efficiency is the soul of progress. Deliver. The contents. He turned the card over. Stamped in blue ink was the emblem of a private institute I recognized from news reports, the Royal Institute of Chemical Advancement, known colloquially as RICA. As RICA. Now the shadows take shape, Holmes murmured. The mastermind is not in hiding. He is protected by academia, by bureaucracy, by position. We returned at once to Baker Street, where Holmes made inquiries by wire. By evening, the confirmation arrived, a senior researcher at RICA, name of Julian Rathbone. Expertise in thermochemistry. Known for his radical ideas on energy, dismissed from the Admiralty's advisory board for proposing disruptive deployment of reactive compounds in civil sectors, publicly disavowed, but privately active. Holmes sat back, fingertips steepled. Rathbone, Jr. He initiated this under the guise of theoretical research. But when the ministry dismissed his ideas, he turned to practical demonstration. Fergus and Vetch were his. Tools, Greaves Bakery, his proving ground. The network, his message to the world. And now? Now, Holmes said, he will try to disappear. But we shall not let him. That night, we rode by cab to the RICA headquarters, located near Lambeth, a grand brick structure with shuttered windows and a gate patrolled by a solitary constable. Holmes presented a letter of warrant signed by Gregson himself, and we were allowed entry. Inside, the building was silent save for the occasional creak of old beams. The guard pointed us toward Rathbone's office, top floor, last door on the right. It was unlocked. The office was in a state of hurried abandonment. Papers scattered, drawers open, a half-packed valise on the desk. A journal lay open, its most recent entry fresh in black ink. The network has collapsed. The formula is known. Phase 2 is compromised. All records must be destroyed. Egypt remains an option. Alexandria is still open. I leave tonight. Holmes closed the journal. We are not late, Watson, he said, heading to the stairwell. But we are close. We alerted the yard and rushed to Victoria Station, where the night express to Dover was due to depart. Holmes, ever ahead of the clock, scanned the passengers boarding at platform 6. There, he pointed. A tall man in a grey coat, valise in hand, slipped between 2 guards. Holmes moved swiftly, intercepting him just as the train gave its final hiss. Dr. Rathbone, Holmes said, seizing his arm. The experiment is over. Rathbone turned, his face composed, as though he had expected it all along. I was only ever trying to make the Empire stronger, he said quietly. They wouldn't listen. Holmes replied, they will now in court. As the constables took him away, I looked at Holmes, who stood silent under the rising steam of the engine. Do you think there are others? I asked. There are always others, he said. But this one, we have stopped. And for that night at least, London slept a little safer. The morning after Rathbone's capture dawned crisp and colourless, a pale fog resting over the city like gauze across a wound. Holmes, though triumphant in the manner of his deductions, was not at ease. He stood at the window of our Baker Street rooms, with his hands folded behind his back, his pipe unlit, his gaze distant. I had seen that look before. It meant invariably that something still disturbed the symmetry of the case. I turned from my notes, where I had been attempting to summarize the events of the past days. How you do not believe it's finished? He didn't turn. Not yet. Rathbone is the architect. Yes, the network, the formula, the delivery method. All of that ties back to him. But he was never alone in this. A scheme of this complexity cannot be executed by a single disgruntled scientist. No. There is one more player, Watson, one whose role has yet to be revealed. I knew better than to interrupt. Holmes turned then, his eyes sharp. When we intercepted Rathbone at Victoria Station, he made no attempt to flee, no resistance. He spoke calmly. That in itself is revealing. He did not believe he had failed. Perhaps he thought he might still escape through legal ambiguity. Perhaps. But more likely, he believed that the heart of the operation, the part he valued, most was already beyond our reach. You mean another formula? Holmes shook his head. No, something larger. He said, Egypt remains an option. Alexandria is still open. That was not just a reference to a smuggling route. It was a signal, a phase, a destination, or perhaps a person. He crossed the room to the cabinet and drew from it the journal we had taken from Rathbone's office. It was bound in red leather, the initials J.R. impressed upon the cover. Holmes flipped through the pages again, this time more slowly, more methodically. At the midpoint he paused, his finger resting on a passage written 3 weeks prior. J.K. Expressed concern about visibility. Suggested alternate carrier. Recommend phasing shift to Eastern Access via Hartnell. Maintain correspondence via the Guild. He tapped the initials. J.K., he said slowly. Not a contact I recall among the captured. Not Vetch, not Fergus, and certainly not Elridge or Underwood. The Guild? I echoed. Most likely the Bakers' Guild. Rathbone needed intermediaries, contacts who could be publicly seen in the trade. If J.K. was one of them, we must find him. He reached for the directory of tradesmen and guild members, a thick volume he kept filed beneath his monographs. Within minutes, he had found the entry. Jonathan Keane, committee secretary of the London Bakers' Guild, based on Little Gower Street, Bloomsbury. He stood. Dress warmly, Watson. We pay a visit to Mr. Keane. The guild offices were housed in a staid brick building with brass lettering above the door and a modest smell of rye and ink. Inside, the clerk received us with a flicker of recognition and nervous respect. I believe Mr. Keane is in the committee room, gentlemen, he said, not quite meeting Holmes's gaze. I'll see if he's available. He vanished quickly, and I caught Holmes scanning the corridors with quick glances. His hand rested casually inside his coat. Watch the clerk, he said softly. If he runs, follow. But the clerk did not run. He returned, visibly pale. Mr. Keane has, stepped out. Some urgent business at the docks. Left barely 10 minutes ago. Holmes smiled thinly. Then I imagine he's not walking. We left at once, hailing a cab, and took the fastest route eastward. Holmes leaned from the window as we passed through Aldgate, his eyes scouring every street corner and alley. At last, as we crossed Whitechapel Road, he rapped sharply on the roof. There, on the far side of the thoroughfare, a figure in a long wool coat was boarding a tram. Holmes leapt from the cab with a force that startled the horse, and I scrambled. After him, we caught up just as the tram began to pull away. Holmes swung aboard, pressing through the passengers until he reached the rear. The man was there, tall, clean-shaven, his coat too fine for his station. He turned, surprised, but not enough. Mr. Keane, Holmes said coolly. I presume you're on urgent guild business? Keane's expression hardened. You're making a mistake. I make very few of those. Shall we speak privately? Keane bolted. Holmes was after him in an instant, vaulting off the moving tram and down the adjacent alley. I followed, feet pounding, heart in my throat. We darted through back streets, past crates and startled vendors, until Keane took a wrong turn into a cul-de-sac. Holmes tackled him hard and clean, pinning him against the wet brick. I should warn you, Holmes hissed. I am not in the mood to chase anyone today. Keane struggled, then sagged. You don't understand. I only facilitated things. I didn't create this. No, that was Rathbone, and now he's in custody, but you were his eyes. You supplied the distribution points, the bakers, the routes. Keane said nothing. Holmes drew from his coat a paper, one of Rathbone's. Letters. This note refers to you. You advised him. You maintained secrecy. Why? Maintained secrecy. Because I believed in what he was doing, Keane spat. We're being left behind. Other countries are building machines that melt steel. Rathbone saw the future. All I did was help him stay hidden. Holmes nodded slowly. And Alexandria? Keen's eyes flicked upward. Holmes caught the glance. Someone else is involved. Keen hesitated. She doesn't know everything. She only received what we sent. Who? His daughter, Clara. She's in Alexandria, sent there 3 months. Agel. He said she would carry the second formula, the perfected one. I exhaled. Holmes stepped back, releasing him. You will take us to your records, everything you have on the shipments and recipients. Then you will deliver a statement to the Yard. And what about Rathbone's daughter? Holmes turned to me. We'll need to wire the consulate in Egypt. Have them intercept her before the handoff is complete. But what if it already happened? I asked. Holmes glanced eastward, his jaw set. Then the world may yet burn from a loaf of bread. Back. In Baker Street, the mood was taut and electric. Holmes paced before the hearth with sharp, angular movements, his hands restless at his sides. The name Clara Rathbone had changed the tempo of the investigation. No longer were we merely tracking smugglers and saboteurs across the alleys of London. Now the threat had crossed borders. I sat at the writing desk, drafting a telegram under Holmes's dictation. Every word was carefully chosen, each implication deliberate. To British Consulate, Alexandria urgent, intercept, Clara Rathbone, daughter of Julian Rathbone, arriving or already in your jurisdiction. Suspected courier of incendiary material disguised. As baking goods or trade supplies, hold for investigation. Holmes, Baker Street. As Mrs. Hudson dispatched the wire, Holmes turned to the maps spread across our table. A sea chart of the Eastern Mediterranean, a rail line timetable from Port Said to Cairo, a shipping manifest from the London Maritime Exchange, all of it pointed to one conclusion. Clara was more than a naive courier. Her journey had been arranged, with the precision of a military operation. You believe she's knowingly involved? I asked. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pressed his fingers to his temples. She may be. Or she may believe herself to be continuing her father's research under the noble illusion of progress. But Watson, consider Rathbone's words. Phase 2 is compromised. That tells us Phase 2 was in motion. Clara is not delivering a formula to a fellow scientist. She is delivering it to someone who will use it. Use it how? I asked, though I suspected the answer. As a demonstration, a proof of capability, perhaps to a buyer, perhaps to a foreign agent. But the nature of the compound, its concealment methods, Watson, it was not devised for sabotage alone. It was engineered to be sold. Holmes turned abruptly to the door. We must go to the Yard. Keen's records must be copied and shared with the Foreign Office immediately, and Gregson must contact the Admiralty. I have a suspicion about where Clara might attempt her rendezvous, and we haven't a moment to lose. The sky outside had dimmed to a slate grey by the time we reached Scotland Yard. Inside, Holmes wasted no time. He directed Gregson to secure Keen in protective custody, then insisted upon immediate review of the guild records retrieved that afternoon. The ledgers were large and methodically kept, each baker's address, every delivery route, names of long-standing members. But one name appeared again and again in peripheral margins, often with vague annotations. Cross-check, E. Levant route. C. Mark, C.R. Holmes pointed. Here. Clara Rathbone did not operate under her full name. She used initials and she worked through a shell guild established in Cyprus 2 years ago. Note the reference to E. Levant route. That's Alexandria. Gregson leaned over the desk. If she's already crossed into Ottoman territory, we'll need diplomatic help. Holmes's expression was grim. I've already sent word. To the consulate. But we may also need the Navy. He turned to me. Watson, do you recall the ledger line I showed you weeks ago in Greaves's shop? The delivery addressed to Mr. Palmer. There was a code number appended to that note. Shipment 7. We've since seen references to Code 7 and the Alexandria route. This confirms the number represents a specific shipment. If Clara carries it now, we must determine who arranged for its reception. Gregson, to his credit, wasted no time. I'll have my men cross-reference port traffic to identify any known associates of Rathbones. Any vessel scheduled to arrive in Alexandria within the last 5 days or the next 3 will be inspected. But Holmes, as ever, was already moving past it. That won't be enough, he said. She may not arrive by ship at all. She may already be in Egypt. He turned to me. Watson, I need you to draft a second telegram. I took up my pen. To Colonel Henry Marsden, British Intelligence Liaison. Cairo Rathbone operation extends to Egypt. Daughter Clara Rathbone in possession of incendiary compound, likely indisguised. Form. Probable intention. Sale or transfer to foreign actors. Intercept immediately. Advise securing of ports, rail hubs. Holmes, Baker Street. The telegram was dispatched by priority cipher. Holmes, satisfied for the moment, returned home with me just after 9. Though he said little, his mind was evidently still hard at work. He paced for hours, consulting charts and notebooks, occasionally muttering lines from Rathbone's journal under his breath. At nearly midnight, he stopped. Watson, he said quietly, I fear we may not stop her in time. I rose. We've alerted the necessary channels. If she's intercepted at the port, he said, cutting me off. But what if she is not intercepted? What if she has already made contact with her recipient? I hesitated. Then, she has passed the compound. Precisely. And consider this. Clara was a student of chemistry, educated under her father's tutelage. What if she carries not the compound, but the means to produce it? A chill passed over me. She could reconstitute it anywhere, I said, with only the right base materials. Holmes turned back to the window, the lamplight casting his shadow like a cross upon the floorboards. Imagine it, Watson. A handful of powders, a few common reagents, and in the heart of a city, a single unremarkable oven becomes a weapon. We said little after that. He did not sleep, nor did I. The next morning a wire arrived, short, abrupt, but crucial. From Colonel Marsden, Cairo Clara Rathbone located, in custody. Possessed written formula, not substance. Claims scientific intent. Denies knowledge of application. Compound details verified, investigation ongoing. Agent seeking local contact. Gratitude for advance notice. Holmes read the message, then slowly folded it. She knew, he said finally, but perhaps not all of it. She understood the formula, yes, but not the intended use. Her father fed her idealism and cloaked the rest in misdirection. I asked the question that had been sitting heavy in my mind. Do you believe she'll face charges? Holmes's voice was low. I believe she should be spared, but the decision rests with others. He stood then, the great engine of his mind settling into stillness. We may have reached the end of this thread, Watson. Rathbone's ring is broken. The formula is no longer secret. The channels of delivery are dismantled. But mark my words, this was only one scheme. There are others like it, clever, hidden, ordinary on the surface. More messages in bread? Perhaps not in bread, he said, but the principle will persist. Deception thrives in plain view. It always has. And as he turned to the fire, placing the last page of Rathbone's journal into the flames, I understood that what we had uncovered was not just a criminal conspiracy, but a warning, a glimpse into a future where even the simplest things might carry the heaviest consequences. The days that followed Clara Rathbone's capture passed not with the triumphant air of conclusion, but with the uneasy silence that so often follows the breaking of a storm. Holmes remained still for long periods, his violin untouched in the corner, the fire in our sitting room left to die to grey ash. I had seen this behavior before. The acute focus of the chase left behind a peculiar vacuum in his spirit, a restlessness that hinted at some unresolved tension deep within the case. We received word from Cairo again. Colonel Marsden's second telegram was more detailed and in parts more troubling. Clara Rathbone refuses consular representation, insists on returning formula to scientific council, denies intention to sell. One local intermediary detained, released for lack of evidence. Rathbone files secured, nothing yet linked to foreign powers. Permission requested for reinforced investigation into private guilds operating in ports of call. Advise. Holmes tapped the telegram with one long finger, deep in thought. They've caught the flame, but not the matchstick. I do not believe Clara Rathbone to be entirely innocent, but neither do I think her father fully trusted her. What we saw, Watson, was a redundancy, a fail-safe. Rathbone knew he might be compromised. He ensured his ideas would outlive him. He rose and went to the shelf where he had placed the copy of Rathbone's earlier theoretical paper, the one which had been rejected by the Admiralty. He opened it to the appendix, pages filled with cryptic notations and formulae so dense even I, trained in basic chemistry, could barely follow. Here, he said, beneath the formal structure are footnotes, references to lab work carried out in tandem with external trials. These are never named, never credited, but one abbreviation repeats often, LG. He looked up at me, eyes suddenly clear. London Guild. It was not just Keene. You think others were involved? I think, Holmes said, we have been looking at Rathbone's methods and ignoring his enablers, the guilds, Watson. Keene may have provided routes and couriers, but he also protected Rathbone with layers of legitimate commercial activity. Who else signed off on those documents? Who allowed anonymous orders? No paper payments, disguised shipments in flower crates. He returned to the fireplace and stared into the fading embers. It's not over, because the system that protected Rathbone is still intact. The next morning brought a letter. No envelope, no postmark, hand-delivered sometime in the night. It was addressed not to Holmes, but to me, Dr. Watson. I do not seek absolution, nor do I offer confession. I offer you instead the truth you and your companion have been circling. My father built the framework, yes, but it was never his alone. You have seen the outer ring, but not the heart. If you want it, look where the flower isn't white. CRI read the message twice and handed it silently to Holmes. He read it once, then again, more slowly, his brow knitting. She's cleverer than I gave her credit for, he said at last. This isn't a riddle, it's a direction. What do you suppose she means? Where the flower isn't white. Holmes smiled faintly. What do we know about flour, Watson? That it's used to make bread? And that different kinds exist. Rye, barley, wheat, spelt. Precisely, Holmes interrupted. Rathbone's preferred method of message delivery was through dense rye loaves, difficult to inspect, heavier and more likely to disguise weight discrepancies. White flour is easily sifted, easily inspected, but darker flours, they hide secrets. He strode to the cabinet where he had filed the original supply invoices from Greaves's shop. Here, he said, flipping quickly, 3 months ago, a second supplier begins providing specialty flours, black barley, dark rye, Turkish spelt. Not Greaves as usual, all routed through a secondary warehouse near Wapping Dock. The name on the supply docket, Ellerman Milling Company. Another. Front? Let's find out. By mid-afternoon, we stood before a long, soot-stained brick building that crouched beside the docks like a warehouse grown out of the fog. No signage adorned the exterior, save for a rusted placard that read simply, Ellerman. The foreman, a stooped man with a miller's chalky sleeves and heavy jowls, gave us a wary eye as Holmes displayed his warrant and offered only one explanation. A matter of national concern. We were shown into the storage floor, a massive space packed with burlap sacks piled high, each labeled in code-like shorthand, BR, TS, DR. Holmes moved among them with deliberate speed, tapping the sacks, weighing them by hand. Then he stopped. This, one. Notice anything? I shook my head. He reached into the top layer of one of the DR sacks labeled dark rye and pulled up a sample. Then, reaching deeper, he extracted something very different. A sealed oilskin packet, no larger than a book. He opened it. Inside were 4 small vials, marked with strange sigils rather than names. Alongside them, a folded paper bearing yet another. Diagram, curved arrows, flame symbols, something resembling a scale. This, Holmes said, is not flour. He stood, his voice growing sharper. We've found the true channel, Watson. Rathbone's formula was only part of it. Here, beneath, the cover of legitimate milling, lies the machinery of something larger. Weapon testing, storage, possibly even manufacture. A shout interrupted us. We turned to see the foreman attempting to slip through a rear stairwell. Holmes gave chase without hesitation, cornering the man just outside a narrow passage filled with sacks. The man's face was pale, but his eyes defiant. "You've no right," he growled. "I have every right," Holmes snapped. "You've been storing and preparing materials linked to a known incendiary plot. We've seized the formula, the couriers, and the daughter. What we lack is the factory, and now I believe we've found it." The foreman said nothing, but Holmes had seen enough. By dusk, Scotland Yard had cordoned off the warehouse. Chemical experts confirmed the packets were volatile compounds, some completed, others mid-preparation. Further inspection of the mill revealed a second floor fitted with drying racks and false storage bins, an improvised lab hidden above the very flour that fed London's bread. Back in Baker Street, Holmes finally allowed himself the smallest measure of rest. He sat with legs stretched toward the fire, pipe in hand, the evening paper unopened in his lap. "You see now, Watson," he said quietly, "why Clara Rathbone never fought us. She wasn't running. She was leading us just far enough. She wanted this discovered. She wanted her father's legacy buried. But she couldn't do it alone. Her cryptic note, the delivery to Egypt, perhaps she was seeking help. Or perhaps she simply feared what would come next if someone more ruthless than Rathbone took over. And now?" Holmes looked into the fire. "Now it's done, for the moment. But mark my words, we have entered a new era, one in which war is not waged only with guns or spies, but with crates of flour and messages that burn before they are read." And in the growing quiet I felt the strange weight of it all settle over me. The case had begun with a loaf of bread, but the trail it had revealed had been anything but simple. It was, as ever, Holmes who had followed it to the end, through fire and misdirection, to the truth buried in the most unassuming of places. 3 days after the Ellerman Mill was shuttered under armed guard and the last of the concealed vials confiscated, London began to forget. That is to say, it returned to its usual distractions: parliamentary squabbles, theatre scandals, and a newly sighted comet over Surrey. But within the rooms of 221B Baker Street, the dust of the affair still lingered, not in particles but in thought, heavy and unspoken. Holmes, though never one to seek accolades, had received a discreet letter from the Foreign Office, a rare acknowledgement couched in cautious phrasing, noting that certain volatile shipments had been intercepted at origin, thanks in part to actionable information. It was unsigned, save for the modest imprint of a red lion in the lower right corner. He tossed the letter onto the mantel without a word. Instead, his interest had turned inward. He read through Rathbone's original scientific papers again, but this time with a different intensity, not to decode, but to understand. Not the structure of the formula, but the mind that birthed it. Rathbone was no anarchist, he said to me over tea one morning, no wide-eyed revolutionary or thrill-seeker. He saw himself as a visionary, one who had glimpsed a future in which wars were won not by men, but by elements. Combustion as currency, heat as a signature of power. I stirred my tea slowly, and yet he handed that vision to criminals and smugglers. "Because no one else would accept it," Holmes replied. Or so he believed. He sought validation, first, from the Admiralty, then from the guilds, and finally from the shadows. And the irony, Watson, is that his plan might have succeeded had he not tried to make a spectacle of it. It was the message inside the bread, the poetic gesture that unraveled him. There was something almost mournful in his voice, as though he regretted the brilliance of a man so fundamentally misguided. But the case, as cases do, was not entirely finished. A letter arrived that evening, delivered by private courier. It bore no sender's mark, but was addressed in a fine slanted script to Holmes alone. He opened it with his usual economy of motion, but his eyes narrowed as they scanned the lines. He read it once, then passed it to me in silence. "Mr. Holmes, what was broken can be rebuilt. What was discovered can be replicated. You may have halted a process, but not the idea behind it. The principle lives on, not in compounds, but in minds. We do not resent you. Indeed, we admire your precision, but do not think you have removed the fire from the world. You have merely scattered its embers. Until next time, a witness. I looked up, but Holmes was already pacing. This, he said, is not a threat, nor even a warning. It is a declaration. I frowned. From whom? One of Rathbone's allies. More. Likely a sympathizer. Someone not directly involved, but invested. These types rarely act alone. They build rings of silence around themselves. Rathbone was the scientist, Keane the facilitator, Clara the courier. But this voice, this witness, they are the observer, the historian. They survived unnoticed to ensure continuity. Continuity, I repeated. Holmes stopped pacing. Watson, the most dangerous ideas are not the ones that explode, but the ones that spread. Whoever wrote this is telling us that what Rathbone began was never meant to end with him. The formula, the flower, the messages, those were just the vehicle. The idea of using the mundane as a weapon, the harmless as a cloak, that is what endures. He crossed to the bookshelf and pulled down a slim black volume I had not seen him touch in years, Strategic Concealment in Military History. He opened it to a marked page and tapped a line. Napoleon once said that a revolution is an idea which has found its bayonets. Rathbone had no army, but he had a distribution method. A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression guarded. "Inspector Gregson to see you, Mr. Holmes. He says it's urgent." Gregson appeared moments later, hat still in hand, his coat wet with evening drizzle. "Sorry to trouble you, Holmes," he said, "but there's been another incident. Dockside, Old South Wharf, a small fire contained quickly, no injuries, but it's the cause of the blaze that concerns us." He pulled a scorched tin from his satchel and placed it on the table. Holmes examined it at once. The label was barely legible, but the lettering was familiar. Ellerman Milling Company, blend number 7. Inside, a faint trace of grey residue clung to the corners. Gregson continued, "It was found in a shipment meant for a private bakery in Bristol. A security check flagged it due to discrepancies in the manifest. One of the workers knocked it over by accident. Flame shot 6 feet into the air. He's lucky to have his eyebrows." Holmes looked to me. "Blend number 7, Watson. The same designation we saw months ago. They've resumed production." "But we shut down the mill," I said. "Arrested the men, seized the stock. Then someone else resumed it, perhaps in another location, or someone salvaged enough of Rathbone's work to duplicate it." Gregson cleared his throat. "There's more. We've been watching activity around the Old Guildhall, foot traffic at odd hours. Late-night carts arriving empty and leaving covered. I believe Keane's arrest didn't sever every thread." Holmes nodded slowly. "Of course not. Guilds do not die overnight, and those invested in secrecy tend to have multiple exits." He rose and turned to the window, the city stretching out before him like a waiting puzzle. "This is no longer a single investigation," he said. "It is a pattern, a shadow system." "Then what do we do?" I asked. "We do what we always do, Watson," he said quietly. "We trace the shadow to its source. We study the ash. We follow the scent." He turned back to Gregson. "You'll double the surveillance on all guild properties. Interrogate any shipment bearing a flower designation with numerical coding, and find out who's still paying the lease on the Ellerman building. And you?" Holmes stepped to his desk and opened the drawer where he kept his disguises. "I'm going to see what they think survives when the fire dies out." That night, as he left under the guise of a dock worker, coat turned and cap pulled low, I watched from the window. And though I had seen Holmes vanish into darkness many times before, I had never felt the weight of the unknown more acutely. For I understood now that this case, which had begun with a single loaf of bread, had unearthed a larger truth. One, not only about science or crime, but about the world that was rapidly taking shape around us. A world in which knowledge and destruction could ride in the same carriage, hidden by nothing more than a simple crust of rye. It was 2 weeks before I saw Holmes again, in any condition approaching normalcy. The fire of pursuit had burned long and quiet as he worked from shadow to shadow, donning the identities of shipping clerks, mill hands, and once a battered chemist with a flask of rancid barley extract that I would later learn was a smoke compound of his own invention. When he returned to Baker Street one mist-laden morning, it was with his overcoat dusty, his eyes rimmed with sleepless vigor, and his lips bearing the faintest trace of satisfaction. "I have them," he said simply, before removing his coat and sinking into his chair. I placed the teapot on the burner and said nothing. I had learned long ago not to prod him in those first few moments. He spoke again once the steam began to rise. The guild was the shell. The real power lay beneath it. A subcommittee formed quietly over the last 4 years, nominally for the standardization of flour weights across Britain. But in truth it functioned as a distribution ring. They called themselves the Grange Circle. Half bakers, half financiers, and 1 or 2 disgraced academics. Rathbone's allies? Initially. His patrons, later his beneficiaries. After he was rejected by the Admiralty, they funded his work privately. Keane was their public face, Rathbone their intellect, Clara their conscience in a way. He pulled a folded sheet from his inner coat pocket and passed it to me. Inside was a list of names, printed neatly in Holmes's hand. I recognized a few from public lectures, 1 or 2 from scientific journals, and 1, a Lord Altham, from political society pages. Holmes saw my expression. Yes, Watson, that was the danger, not the formula, not even the flour. The danger was legitimacy. This was no anarchist plot. These were men of influence, embedding ideas into trade like ink into paper. But now the ink is exposed. I leaned forward. What happened? Holmes's voice was quiet. I attended one of their meetings, in disguise, of course, posing as an Eastern agent seeking to replicate the formula in South Asia. I had a full copy of Rathbone's notes, prepared in a cipher they believed I had cracked. I promised them a new laboratory in Bombay. He paused, then smiled faintly. They took the bait, every one of them. He reached for the newspaper on the end table and opened it to the second page. There, in a short column beneath the shipping, "Notices" was the headline. "Secret network of industrial sabotage discovered. Officials detained after anonymous." Tip Holmes folded the paper. "They will not be charged publicly. Too much at stake. But they will be ruined, stripped of their titles, their influence, their reach. And the guild will be reorganized, I am told, under military audit. And Clara?" He looked into the fire. "She remains in Egypt, the foreign office believes it safest to leave her under the supervision of the consulate. She has agreed to provide testimony, anonymously. It seems she was never a true believer, only a daughter trying to prove her father right." We sat for a moment. In silence, the kettle hissed. Outside, a bell rang distantly, a milk cart perhaps, and then Holmes spoke again, almost as if to himself. "Watson, there is something singularly terrifying about the way they chose to hide their ambitions, not behind armies nor manifestos, but behind something so gentle, so essential, as bread. To take the daily staple of life and fill it with a threat, masked beneath crust and crumb, it is the very essence of subversion." He reached for his pipe, finally lighting it. "But that is where the true work lies. Not in catching murderers or thieves, but in catching ideas before they grow legs and call themselves justice." I looked at him then, not as a friend, but as what he was, a singular mind forever navigating the edge between order and chaos, unwilling to rest while even one ember smoldered in the dark. "You've stopped a quiet war," I said, "and no one will ever know." He exhaled a ribbon of smoke. "Let them eat their bread in peace, Watson, that will be enough." And so ended the affair of the message hidden in bread, not with a gunshot or a gallows, but with the quiet dismantling of a machine built from flour, fire, and faith misplaced. And though the public would never know how close they had come to danger, one man in a small room on Baker Street would always remember that even the most innocent crust can conceal a spark